go. Okay, so we're talking about the importance of a person protecting himself from damaging other people. And so we saw the halacha. We were looking at the Aruch HaShulchan yesterday, and we basically went through this whole idea that when you're conducting any abnormal activity in Rishus HaRabim, you bear responsibility. The only reason why on Erev Shabbos you're going to be exempt is the public has become accustomed to accepting a certain kind of behavior on Erev Shabbos in certain locations. That doesn't mean that every location is the same in this respect. So let's just keep that in mind. Just want to make sure before we go on to the next sif that we've covered everything. Pretty sure we've covered all of our bases. So I think we're ready to go on to the next sif. Okay. Have I shared my screen yet? Okay, let me share my screen. There we go. Okay. Bib o marteif, sheyesh bo mayim sruchim. Sif Chaf Gimel, on page Kuf Ayin Ches. Okay, so Biv o marteif, these are types of pipes or aqueducts that contain putrid or bad water, dirty water. Asr l'shobcham b'rishus harabim b'amos. Let's see. I have my mouse today. B'amos hachama ella aldas lefanosa la'alter. Unless a person's intention is to immediately move them to another place. In other words, you cannot leave them, allow them to flow in the summer months when there's no liquid anticipated on the streets. Remember, the streets there were dirt streets. It was quite typical in the winter for the streets to be filled with mud and water and puddles, because that was the norm. Just imagine if you're walking on a dirt path in Canada in November, invariably you're going to have to be wearing boots and protective gear for your pants. You're not going to wear a tuxedo through that area. So people are expecting there to be dirty streets in the winter. But in the summer months, people expect a dirt road to be pretty solid, pat, and not to be wrought with puddles. So if I cause water to flow into a Rishus Harabim, I'm inconveniencing the public in an unreasonable way. So therefore, you're not allowed to cause water, your wastewater, to divert into the public thoroughfare in the summer months, ella aldas lefanosa la'alter, unless your intention is to cause that water to vacate the public area immediately. Uviyamos hageshamim mutar, and in the winter months, you are allowed to divert wastewater into the public area, which of course would, you think of a third world country when people do that. You think of India, you think of China, right? And of course, when these halachas were written, all Jews were living in third world countries. There was no such thing as a first world country in the medieval world. Aval mei shovchin nikiyim, or maybe they were just starting maybe in the 19th century. Aval mei shovchin nikiyim mutar l'shovcham b'rishus harabim afilu b'yamos hachama. He says, but what you are allowed to divert into a public thoroughfare is clean waste, clean water. Mei shovchin nikiyim. In other words, if it's clear water and you just don't need it anymore, because let's say you were using it to give your kids a bath, and then but it's perfectly clean water, so then you're allowed to spill that out into a rishus harabim afilu b'yamos hachama, even in the summer months. Lefi she'ein shohin umisakvin klal b'rishus harabim k'mo hasruchim va'achurim ela yordim miyad mimakom gavoa lemakom namoch. Because water that's spilled generally dissipates very quickly. If there's any kind of slant, which invariably there is, there's any kind of slope, the water will immediately run down the road and basically evaporate at some point. So therefore, it depends on the type of water. If it's wastewater that's dirty and smelly, so then you don't have a right to spill it out into Rishus Harabim in the summer, only in the winter. If it's regular, relatively clean wastewater, so then you are allowed to spill it out. Obviously, we can't be talking about huge amounts of water, but from a private residence, that seems to be what the halach is saying. So let's take a look at the Imrei Yaakov. Asur l'shovcham. So he says, Gamim hamayim yotzim milamata derech hakarka. He says this is true even if the water is spilled out from below via the soil. That's also going to be asur. Aval imheim mekalchim milamala gam b'shovchen she'enam sruchim asur. He says, and the fact is that if this water makes its way to the surface, let's say you have some kind of below ground pipe, but the water finds its way up to ground level, then even if the water is not dirty, it's going to be asur. Kevin shehem mafriim v'lefa'amim noflim al chafetzim shel ha'ovrim v'shavim, because it's very possible that this water will disturb the public and cause people's objects to get wet when they don't want them to get wet. V'lachein asur lahorid es hamayim shel shtifat haritzpa min habayit derech tzinor shehu me'al hamadrecha. And therefore, for that reason, let's say you have a drain pipe, like they have in Israel, that where the water, when you do the spongia in the apartment, right? You know what I'm talking about, right? They clean the apartment, and there's a drain pipe, and then that pipe goes out. Me'al hamadrecha. Let's see. Sha'ovrim shamrabim. That pipe cannot spill out over a place where people are walking. So, unfortunately, with some of the older buildings, like in Mea Sharim or in other places that are really where the buildings are really, really old, some of these pipes do spill out to where people are walking, and you have to look ahead of you to see who's doing their spongia, So that's an important issue if it's going to spill on people. Okay, fine. Uviyamos hageshamim mutar, and in the winter months it's permitted. Ve'afal pichein b'mhuzak adam o behema b'mayim chayavim nezik shalim. Now here's an interesting caveat. Even though permission is granted to spill out your water in the winter months onto the street, but if you spill out a huge puddle and someone or an animal gets injured as a result, then you're still liable for the damages, even though permission is granted for you to do so. But if it creates so much hazard that someone does get injured, you have to assume liability because you've created a bore in Rishus Harabim, like we've talked about before. Elayor dimiyad, but in the summer months, even in the summer months, if the water is clear, then it's okay because the water will spill and go down a slope. But also realize that if, let's say, the water that you spill out in the summer months is clear and clean, it's perfectly fine, but someone slips and falls as a result of the water, you're going to have to assume liability as well. So this last halacha is very interesting because while it's granting permission, it doesn't free you from liability, right? And okay, so let me just look and see if there's any likutim. Okay. All right, let's take a look at the likutim.
The last thing you can do it.
Right.
So you're gonna be liable is like contradicting.
It's not a contradiction because it's telling you you have permission because the public generally knows how to protect itself when it's a normal amount of water. And the public also takes proper precautions to protect themselves against getting dirty. But if it creates a hazard, you have to realize that whenever you create a hazard to the public, you're going to be liable. But it has to be proven that a person slipped and fell because of the extra water that you poured out. It could be they slipped and fell because it was just slippery anyway, even without your water. That would have to be demonstrated. Okay. All right. So in the Likutim, on the previous page, the Likutim is Moshe's case histories, and sort of elaborations on the halacha. Chamesh chatzeros hashopchos maim lebiv echad v'nistam kalkel. Let's say you have a sewer pipe that is shared by 5 different properties, 5 different courtyards or 5 different homes. Divert all of their wastewater through one pipe. And that pipe becomes clogged or it becomes broken. Kulam tzrichim lihishtatef bahotza'a l'sayeya l'tachtona im nitkalkala negda. He says all of the people whose water diverts through that pipe have to pitch in to pay for the repair. He says, Mishum di'im lo yazuvu hamayim b'shofi misham mimela yamdu hamayim gam neged ha'elyona. He's describing a lower pipe and a higher pipe, and I'm not sure I understand the plumbing, but basically he says that if the water does not flow properly through the pipe that these people own, it's going to cause the water to get clogged up further down. Masha ein kein im nitkalkel etzel ha'elyona ein hatachtona chayevet l'sayela. However, if a clog happens to someone above, the people down below do not have to pay for it. In other words, if there's water that diverts through a sewer system, then anyone who's above the clog has to participate in the unclogging of the clog. Anyone who's below the clog where the water flows is not responsible because it doesn't affect them. Okay, shaharela tachton lamafriya hadavar de etzla hamayim yordim uloinian havas mayim adin hu lahefech. But so that's with water that you're getting out of your property, like wastewater. But intake water, the halach is just the opposite. That if I'm downstream from water that's being intaken into my property, into my field, or into my house through indoor plumbing, and then there's a clog up above. So anyone who's downstream from the clog has to participate. That if 5 courtyards or fields or homes are receiving water from one pipe or from one aqueduct, and that becomes clogged, so then all of them, then all of them have to take part in unclogging or fixing the pipe because they all stand to benefit from the service. The cholzman shalomitu kan kiroi makom mirutzat hamayim lo yuchlu lavo hamayim lamata v'nimsa shetikon ha'elyon hitov la'atachton mimena. So it turns out that even though the clog may be occurring only in my localized area, but if it's affecting all the neighbors that are downstream because they need the intake of that water as well, I can expect them to be part of the compensation. So it's interesting, but obviously it all depends on how the clog took place. One would have to do some forensics. How did the clog take place? Did the clog take place because one of the neighbors was negligent, right? And they put something down the drain that they weren't supposed to do, something extremely caustic that caused damage, or something extremely clogging that caused the clog, so then that neighbor would be responsible. But if it's just a natural break in the pipe just because of corrosion over the course of years, so then anyone who benefits from that pipe, even if they're not mamish right there, but they stand to benefit because they're downstream or they're upstream, depending on the scenario. So then they are expected to participate in the repair of that pipe.
Sounds like you have two pipes, one feeds in, one feeds in.
An intake and an outtake. Yeah. I'm not a plumber, but one is intake of the clean water and one is the outtake of the wastewater, which seems like all of our houses have that, right? Okay. Okay.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
we have a scenario where my son he has a house. He's in a sort of a duplex, attached house, and on the other side of the house, it's quite possible that there's water leaking from the other side of the house into from the basement into his side into the basement. So in a case like that, would they share repairs, or is it because it's only in it's in my son's house, even though it may be coming from the other guy's house? Should he be responsible too?
Well, I think wherever the source of the leak is coming from, that's the person who's liable for the repairs. If I think we did learn about a leaky pipe in an apartment building before. We talked about who's responsible for the repairs. We talked about a case of a guy who accidentally left the water dripping in his bathroom and then went to Florida for 4 months. And as a result, he gets a flood. So that person is going to be liable, or his insurance company is going to have to be liable to pay for all damages of flooding that comes into the people that are downstairs from him. In the case of a guy who lives in a duplex and he sees that there's leaking, if it's coming from his neighbor's property into his house and it causes damage, so the neighbor is liable for having a leaky pipe. Is that what you're talking about, Ron?
We're not really sure if it's a pipe or if it's something from underground, because we can't sort of figure out where the source is, but it is coming from that side of the house. So but the neighbor doesn't have any issue with the water.
Yeah. So it's an interesting case. There's something on the neighbor's property that is causing water to go downstream or down with gravity into your son's property. And that seems to be a cause of damage. But you'd have to do some forensic analysis and hire a plumber to figure out where the water's coming from. And if the water's coming from a broken pipe on the upstairs neighbor's property, then it's the upstairs neighbor's responsibility to stop the leak. Here we're talking about sharing a waterway, which is, I don't know if it makes, I don't know if, right, it's the landlord's responsibility if it's a rental, that's true. But I don't know, could you make the argument that it's a pipe that I rely on as well? Because it's an intake pipe and there's a leak on your property. The problem is that leak is not preventing the water from coming into my property. If it was preventing the water from coming into my property, so then I could be expected to pay to unclog the pipe. But here it's just a question of dripping water causing damage, and that leak is happening on your property. So it would seem that the other neighbor is liable for any damages that happens as a result of the leak. That's what it would seem to me. I could be mistaken. But I think based on what we saw I don't remember how many weeks ago we saw that, but we did see that a neighbor is responsible for the pipe that is on his property if it leaks. Okay. Next piece, L'shovchan b'reshus harabim. Shlolit shel megishamim Hamitsuyim b'kvishim b'yamot hachoref. So what does the word shlolit mean again? Let me just do my quick Google Translate. A puddle. Shlolit is a puddle. So you have a puddle of rain that is found in the streets during the winter months. Yesh lanahagim lizaher b'nesiatam. So drivers have to be careful when they're driving in puddles during the winter months. Shelo lahazik ulekalkel bigdei ha'ovrim v'shavim. So as not to cause damage to the pedestrians' clothing. Anyone who's walked past an Egged bus in the winter in Yerushalayim knows how difficult this can be, and you probably in Toronto also. If you're a pedestrian walking past the bus and the bus drives on a puddle, they don't care, But he says that you do have to take precautions. A driver is responsible to take precautions not to cause damage through splashing through a puddle when he's driving over a puddle, which is very difficult to do.
I guess I was thinking if you slow down, it probably causes less splashing. You can't avoid driving through the puddle if there's traffic, but if you slow down, I think the splash is less.
Yes.
If you see something there you don't like, you go extra fast.
Right. And if they do cause damage, let's say a guy's walking to a wedding, he's walking on Bathurst, he's about to go up to the entrance to the Kehila Center on Bathurst, and a bus drives past him and gets his new Armani suit drenched wet with dirty water from the street. So, Sarachian, he says it's not clear from the poskim whether the driver is liable for compensation. And he quotes the Pischei Choshen, and who suggests that the driver will be liable. But Rav Stern says it's not clear to him what the halacha is going to be with a driver who drives through a puddle, because the Rambam, he says, seems to hold that you're putter. And he says, V'tzarachian, it's really not clear to him whether you can
maybe that's a plug for having weddings at the Bayit. There's no big buses going through the parking lot usually.
Okay, there you go. That'll be part of our next ad campaign.
Absolutely. Don't get splashed. Go out, have your splash at the Bayit so you don't get splashed or something like that.
There you go. I liked catastrophe better from yesterday.
Sorry. That's the problem when you do one that's relatively good. It's hard to keep at that level.
Okay. We have two more short halachas to do. Let's just see. We probably won't finish it today. Mutter lahotzi et hazevel v'haglalim l'reshut harabim b'sha'at hotzaat zvalim shel kol adam. You're allowed to take out your garbage and your dung out to the public thoroughfare. Again, thank God for indoor plumbing, right? This is before indoor plumbing. What did people do when they had to go poopy? So many times they had a bucket in their house, and then they would have to empty the bucket out into the street. So you can only do that when the rest of the neighborhood is doing it. I don't want to be around that day. I'm all.
I know I have to take the garbage out in a few minutes, but that's one thing, and this is totally something else.
Yeah, garbage day in the medieval world was not pleasant, okay? Aval shelo b'sha'at hotzaat zvalim asur, ela al da'at lefanoto la'alter. But if it's not garbage day, you're not allowed to take your garbage out on the street, which is, your neighbor will yell at you if you bring it out Wednesday afternoon, like we sometimes do. Hey, it's not garbage day yet, Sometimes, you sometimes, the neighbor I'm talking about, where they have nothing better to do with their lives except to complain because you brought out your garbage a few hours early, right? Because that's what they live for. But anyway, no, I don't have neighbors like that. But I know of people that are like that. Okay. Ella aldat lefanot alter. He says, unless your intention is to remove it immediately. In other words, you're not allowed to leave garbage for any prolonged period of time in the public thoroughfare unless that becomes the convention. Okay. And finally, hachofer birishus harabim, afilu birishus, o eitzel rishus harabim. If a person is digging in a public thoroughfare, even with permission, he gets permission, gets a permit from the city to dig, or if he's digging adjacent to rishus harabim, lo yitzbor ha'afar birishus harabim, the gova gimel tfachim. He's not permitted to create a mound of earth from the hole and leave it in rishus harabim, ella aldat lefanot alter, unless his intention is to clear it out, like by the end of the day, right? Like we learned also by building materials, you have to move the building materials as close away from the public thoroughfare as is reasonably possible when you're doing construction in a near a public area. The same thing is true if you're digging a hole in a public area. You have to create obviously safety, and you also have to make sure that the earth that you pull out of the hole is cleared away from the public at a reasonable amount of time, certainly by the end of the day. Okay. True. Yeah, no, that's true. But again, there's a reasonableness over here. I need to do a construction project. I need to dig because I need to connect to the main sewer line or whatever the situation is. And we need to do repairs to the sewer line or whatever. So what's reasonable? You got to do it. You just have to put up cones or some kind of sign so that the public will see what's going on, or if it's self-evident, maybe even signage is not necessary. But don't put out more than is necessary of an inconvenience into the public thoroughfare. Move things over as far as a way that you can from the public. And even when you have to dump things in the public, make sure it's removed immediately. All right, that concludes chapter 8. Hashem will continue tomorrow.
Shkoyach.
Happy Thanksgiving. Yeah, happy American Thanksgiving, everybody. Yeah, thank you.